The sun over Thebes was a hammer, and the man on his knees was the anvil. His name for now was Kenaman, though he knew that would be the first thing they took from him. An hour ago he had been the high priest of Amun, a whisper away from the pharaoh's ear, a man whose shadow was considered a blessing on the ground it crossed. Now that shadow was just a shrinking patch of darkness in the bleached white dust of the executioner's square. He could smell the crowd before he saw them properly, his head bowed by the guard's heavy hand. They smelled of sweat, of cheap beer and onions, the scent of the common man he had spent a lifetime looking down upon. Now their jeers were a physical force, striking him in waves. They didn't just want his death. That was too simple, too private. They wanted his soul dismantled piece by piece, right here, in the open, where the gods themselves could watch. Kenaman had witnessed this ceremony before, from a gilded platform beside the vizier, a participant in the sacred act of restoring cosmic balance. He had never imagined the view from the centre of the circle. He remembered the words he himself had once spoken, his voice ringing with divine authority, as another wretch was brought low. Let Mahat be satisfied. Let the chaos he has sown be scoured from the land. Now the chaos was his. He had stolen from the god's own treasury, not just a few gold trinkets, but sacred artifacts meant to ensure the fertility of the Nile itself. In his arrogance, he believed Amun would not notice, that the god he served was a distant abstraction, a set of rituals and chants. He had been wrong. His crime wasn't theft. That was a word for a man who steals a loaf of bread. His crime was blasphemy. It was a tear in the fabric of the universe. In ancient Egypt, life was not governed by mere laws made by men. It was governed by Ma'at, the single most important concept in their civilization. Ma'at was not simply justice or law. It was truth, balance, order, harmony, the unshakable rhythm of the cosmos. It was the sun rising every morning, the Nile flooding its banks each year, the stars wheeling in their perfect courses. It was the divine architecture that held the universe together and kept the endless, ravenous chaos, a force they called Isfet, at bay. Every person, from the pharaoh to the lowest farmer, had a duty to live in accordance with Ma'at. To commit a crime was to do more than harm another person. It was an act of cosmic vandalism. It was to invite Isfet into the world, to weaken the foundations of existence, and risk the sun not rising, the Nile running dry, the world plunging into eternal darkness. And a crime committed by a high priest, a man sworn to be the chief defender of Ma'at, was the most dangerous act of all. This is why they couldn't just kill him. His death was a foregone conclusion, a trivial detail. The true purpose of this gathering was not punishment, but a desperate public ritual of purification. His humiliation was the ceremony. His agony was the offering. The crowd understood this on a primal level. Their taunts were not just mockery. They were a chorus of exorcism, casting out the demon of chaos that Kenaman had unleashed among them. The first step was about to begin. The executioner, a massive Nubian whose muscles gleamed with palm oil, approached not with a blade, but with a simple copper chisel and a wooden mallet. This was not a tool of death, but of erasure. Kenaman squeezed his eyes shut, but he could not block out the vizier's voice, cold and clear as obsidian, reading the judgment from a papyrus scroll. The words echoed across the silent square. Kenaman, who was high priest, has betrayed Amun. He has betrayed Pharaoh. He has betrayed Ma'at. He has chosen chaos over order. Therefore, let his name be unnamed. Let the sound of it be a curse on the tongue. Let it be scraped from every stone and every memory, that he may find no path in the afterlife, that his soul may wander in darkness, forever unremembered and unreborn. The vizier finished. The crowd roared its approval. The sound was the grinding of a millstone, and Kenaman knew he was the grain. He felt the rough hands of the guards on his shoulders, forcing him forward, pressing his cheek against a rough stone block brought specifically for this purpose. It was a piece of a temple wall, a sacred surface for a profane act. He could smell the incense still clinging to the stone, a ghostly reminder of the life he had lost. He thought of his tomb, deep in the Valley of the Nobles, its walls covered in hieroglyphs meticulously painted to guide his soul. His name was there, 100 times over. His titles, his lineage, his prayers to Osiris. It was his map to eternity. And he knew that at this very moment, Another team of men was down there, in the cool darkness of his final resting place, doing the same work the executioner was about to do here. They were taking his name, scraping his image from the walls, ensuring his Ka and Br, the twin aspects of his soul, would awaken into a terrifying void, with no memory, no identity, and no destination. The executioner's shadow fell over him. He heard the metallic clink of the chisel being set against the stone right beside his ear. The crowd fell silent, a collective intake of breath. This was the moment. The first blow of the mallet wasn't loud, but it vibrated through Kenneman's skull, a sickening thud that seemed to crack the very foundations of his being. He didn't need to see it. He could hear the sharp scraping sound that followed, the sound of his name, his identity, his eternal life, being chipped away into meaningless dust. This was a fate worse than death. It was the beginning of an eternity of being nothing, and it was only the first of his humiliations. The gods had witnessed his crime, and now they would witness his unmaking. A slow, methodical erasure designed to make even oblivion seem like a mercy. The chisel fell silent, its work of spiritual murder complete. The dust of Kenneman's name, the very substance of his eternal identity, settled into the grime of the square, to be trodden underfoot by the masses he once ruled. But the crowd was not sated. The erasure of a soul was a silent, abstract horror. They needed something visceral, a spectacle of flesh and blood to calm the trembling in their own hearts. They needed to see the chaos physically scourged from his body. Two guards, their faces impassive, as the stone statues guarding the temple gates, hauled him to his feet and dragged him to the centre of the square, tying his wrists to a thick wooden post. His fine linen robes, the mark of his priestly purity, were torn from his back, exposing skin that had never known the harshness of the sun. The crowd surged forward, a wave of humanity held back only by a line of spears. This was what they came for. The vizier's voice cut through the air once more, but this time he was not reading from a scroll. He was speaking to the executioner. Let him feel the sting of his betrayal. Let every blow be a prayer to the gods he has offended. The instrument of this prayer was not a whip, which was a tool for slaves and foreign captives. It was a long, flexible rod of acacia wood, hard as iron. In the hands of the executioner, it became a living thing, whistling through the dry air before it met Kenneman's back. The sound was a wet, percussive crack that echoed off the mud brick walls. Kenneman's body arched, a gasp of agony escaping his lips, but he refused to scream. He was a priest of Amun. He would not give the mob the satisfaction. The second blow landed higher, across his shoulders, and he felt the skin split. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound of grim satisfaction. Each lash was a carefully measured act of theatre. This wasn't a frenzied beating, it was a ritual. 10 lashes, one for each sacred artifact he had stolen. 20 for the years he had deceived his acolytes. 50 for every prayer he had uttered with a lying heart. The blood began to trace intricate patterns on his back, dark red hieroglyphs spelling out the story of his fall. The sun beat down, baking the blood into a grotesque crust. Kenneman's vision began to blur, the faces in the crowd melting into a single, monstrous entity with 1,000 mouths, all chanting for his pain. But this system of public degradation was not reserved for the powerful alone. Mahat was for everyone, and so was the punishment for breaking it. As the final blow fell on Kennemon's ruined back, leaving him hanging, barely conscious from the post, the guards parted the crowd to drag another figure forward. It was a woman. Her name was Merit, and she had been the wife of a master carpenter. Her crime was adultery. To the modern mind, this might seem a private matter, a personal failing. But to the Egyptians, it was a profound threat to order. The family was the state in miniature. A wife's fidelity ensured the clear line of inheritance, the stability of property, and the proper veneration of family ancestors. To commit adultery was to introduce a lie into the bloodline, to create a knot of chaos in the otherwise perfect tapestry of the community. It was a small act of isfet, but like a single termite, it threatened the entire structure. Her husband, his face a mask of shame and fury, stood as her accuser. Her lover had already been dealt with, taken away by soldiers for a summary execution. But for Merit, death was deemed too clean an escape. Her punishment had to be a living one. She stood before the crowd, her head held high, a spark of defiance still in her eyes. She did not weep or beg. The vizier did not even address her. He simply nodded to a different official, a grim-faced man holding a small, curved blade. This was not the bronze of a soldier. It was the sharp flint of a surgeon's knife. The guards seized her, forcing her to her knees, one pulling her head back by the hair. The crowd fell silent again. A different kind of silence this time, laced with a morbid, fascinated horror. This was a punishment they had all heard of in stories, but few had ever seen. The man with the knife stepped forward, and with a single practiced motion, sliced off her nose. The cartilage gave way with a sickening crunch. Merritt's defiant scream was cut short as blood erupted from her face, a crimson torrent that covered her mouth and chin. She was released, and she collapsed, clutching her face, her body racked with shuddering sobs of pure animal pain. The crowd was a mixture of gasps and guttural shouts of approval. This was the justice of Mayat. She would not be killed. She would be allowed to live, to walk among them for the rest of her days, but she would never again be a part of them. Her face was now a permanent declaration of her crime. She was a living monument to chaos, a walking warning to every other woman in Thebes. Every time she tried to eat, every time she spoke, every time she looked at her own reflection in the water, she would be reminded of her transgression. She could never hide, never be anonymous, never start again. Her identity was no longer Merritt, the carpenter's wife. It was Merritt, the adulteress. Her very features had been recarved by the hand of the state to broadcast her sin until the day she died. While Kenneman's punishment was designed to erase him from eternity, hers was designed to chain her to a lifetime of public shame. Two different souls, two different crimes, but the same underlying principle. The body itself was a scroll on which the state would write its warnings, and the pain of the individual was the ink. As Merritt was dragged away, a wailing, bloody testament to social order, the attention of the crowd swung back to the post. Kenneman, now a limp, ruined caricature of the priest he had been, was cut down. He collapsed into the dust, too broken to stand, his breath coming in ragged, shallow rasps. For a moment a flicker of hope, or perhaps just delusion, might have crossed his mind. The flogging was over. The erasure of his name was complete. Surely all that was left was the final, merciful blow of an axe. But the architects of this ritual had a deeper understanding of human suffering. They knew that true humiliation was not just about pain. It was about the methodical stripping away of dignity, layer by brutal layer, until nothing human remained. The next stage was not for the executioner, but for the lowest of the low, the men who cleaned the temple latrines and hauled away the offal from the sacrificial pits. 4 of them approached, their faces blank, their movements slow and deliberate. They carried a simple wooden cart, the kind used to transport dung from the city streets to the fertilizing pits beyond the walls. The crowd began to murmur, a low, excited hum of anticipation. They knew what this meant. This was the part of the ceremony that would be retold in taverns for weeks to come, the detail that would make their children gasp and their enemies shudder. The 4 men, without a word, rolled Kenneman's unresisting body onto the cart, his bleeding back sticking to the filth-encrusted wood. They produced coils of rough rope and proceeded to bind him, not just his hands and feet, but his entire body, lashing him to the cart in a grotesque parody of a mummified corpse. They tied him face up, ensuring he could see the sky, see the tops of the temple pylons he had once commanded, and most importantly, see the faces of the people who now lined the streets, their expressions a mixture of disgust and morbid glee. This was the Peret Keru, the procession of the fallen. It was a ritual reserved for the most despised enemies of the state, a slow, deliberate parade designed to transform a man into a piece of refuse before the eyes of the entire city. It was one thing to be flogged in a single square. It was another to have that agony and shame elongated, stretched out over miles, turning the entire city into a single, vast amphitheatre for one's degradation. The cart began to move, its wooden wheels groaning under the weight of its single passenger. There was no herald, no drumbeat, just the creaking of the wheels and the growing roar of the crowd. The procession did not take the main thoroughfares, the wide, sphinx-lined avenues of the gods. Instead, it plunged into the labyrinthine back alleys of Thebes, the narrow, sunless corridors where the real life of the city festered. Here the smells were overwhelming. Rancid cooking oil, human waste, The cloying sweetness of cheap incense burned to ward off disease. People emerged from their mud brick homes, from workshops and breweries, their faces pressed close to the cart. They didn't just watch, they participated. The procession was their ceremony too. They threw garbage at him. Rotting vegetables, fish heads buzzing with flies, shards of broken pottery. A woman, her face contorted with rage, spat directly into his face. Her husband had been a stonemason who had died working on a temple annex, a project Kenneman had overseen and from which he had siphoned funds. To her, this wasn't just a criminal. This was the man who had stolen the food from her children's mouths. Her gob of spittle was a prayer for justice. For Kenneman, every jolt of the cart was a fresh agony, the rough ropes chafing his raw skin, the filth seeping into his wounds. But the physical pain was a distant echo compared to the psychological torment. He was being paraded through the world he had never known, the world he had considered beneath his notice. These people, whose lives he could have ended with a casual word to the vizier, were now his judges and tormentors. He was no longer Kenneman, the high priest. He was not even a man. He was a thing, an object of revulsion, a piece of living garbage being presented for the city's inspection. He remembered a ritual he had once performed, the annual driving out of the scapegoat, where a priest would lay the sins of the community onto a goat, which was then driven into the desert to be devoured by demons. He now understood what it felt like to be that goat. He was absorbing the city's fears, its frustrations, its rage. His humiliation was a form of civic hygiene, a cleansing of the collective soul. The procession had a specific symbolic destination. It was not heading for the execution grounds or the river. It was heading for the place of the ostraka, the city's dump. This was the final, crushing metaphor. He, who had been a vessel of the divine, would be brought to the place where the city discarded its broken and useless things. He would be displayed among shattered pots, worn-out tools, and the discarded refuse of 1,000,000 anonymous lives. It was the ultimate statement of his new status. He was no longer part of the sacred order of Egypt. He was now just another piece of trash, waiting to be buried and forgotten. The journey seemed to last an eternity, every moment a new and inventive torment, every face in the crowd a mirror reflecting his own complete and utter damnation. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became a physical presence, shimmering off the packed earth streets. And in that haze, Kenneman's past life seemed like a distant, impossible dream. The cart finally shuddered to a halt. The air here was different, thick with the smell of decay, a foul sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. This was the edge of the city, where civilization frayed and bled into the desert. Before them lay the place of the ostraka, a vast, sprawling landscape of refuse. Hills of broken pottery rose like leprous dunes, glittering in the merciless sun. Trenches overflowed with household waste, and the buzz of 1,000,000,000 flies was a constant, maddening drone. This was the city's unconscious mind, the repository of everything it had used, broken and forgotten. And it was here that Kenneman's journey was to end. The guards untied him, not with care, but with the rough indifference of men handling a carcass. They rolled him off the cart, and he landed with a sickening thud on a mound of shattered clay. The sharp edges of the ostraka, the broken shards of pottery used for everything, from tax receipts to children's drawings, bit into his lacerated back, 1,000 tiny knives of discarded history. He was now, quite literally, lying on the trash heap of the society he had once helped to govern. But this was not his execution site. The final act was yet to come. A humiliation designed to strip him not just of his status, but of his very humanity, severing his connection to the most fundamental aspects of Egyptian life. An official, one of the vizier's scribes, unrolled a new papyrus. His voice, though reedy and thin, carried a chilling authority. By the will of Pharaoh, steward of the gods, the traitor Kenneman is declared Shayu, the empty one. He is cut off from the waters of the Nile. He is denied the bread of the living. He is cast out from the shadow of the temple. Let him drink the dust of the red land. Let him eat the scraps of dogs. Let him find no shelter but the rocks, no companion but the scorpion. This was a formal declaration of exile, but it was an exile of a uniquely Egyptian kind. It wasn't just banishment from a place, it was a curse, a ritual severing of his ties to the sources of life itself. To be cut off from the Nile was a spiritual death sentence. The Nile was not just a river. It was the lifeblood of Egypt, a god in its own right. Its waters were holy, its annual flood a promise of rebirth. To be forbidden from it was to be made unclean, untouchable. To be denied bread was to be cast out from the community of mankind. For bread was the symbol of civilization, the product of shared labour and divine blessing. The true horror, however, lay in the final part of the sentence. He was not to be killed. He was to be left here, at the edge of the desert, hobbled and broken to fend for himself. It was a punishment of exquisite cruelty, a death sentence delivered not by a blade, but by the slow, inexorable grind of nature itself. They knew he could not survive. His wounds would fester under the sun, thirst would drive him mad within a day, hunger would gnaw at his belly, but his death would be his own doing. A slow, agonizing process of decay that he would have to witness moment by moment. It was a way for the state to kill him without performing the act of killing, leaving his final moments to the gods in the desert. And it was designed for maximum terror, not just for him, but for everyone who heard of it. The fear of the Red Land, the vast, lifeless desert that flanked their fertile valley, was etched into the Egyptian soul. It was the physical manifestation of Isfet, the realm of chaos, inhabited by demons and restless ghosts. To be cast into it was to be thrown into the waiting jaws of oblivion. As the officials turned to leave, one of the guards approached Kenamon. He held not a weapon, but a small, red-hot iron brand, glowing with heat from a portable brazier. The brand was not a royal cartouche or a temple symbol. It was the simple, crude hieroglyph for donkey. The animal of burden, the symbol of stupidity and stubbornness. The guards pressed the searing metal into the flesh of his forehead. The smell of his own burning skin was the last thing he would ever associate with his old life. The pain was blinding, but the meaning was worse. It was his new name, his new identity, branded onto him for whatever scavenger or lost soul might find his corpse. He was no longer Kenamon, the priest. He was now Donkey, the outcast. This final act served a practical purpose too. Should he somehow survive? Should he crawl back towards the city? That brand would mark him instantly. No one would give him water. No one would give him bread. He was polluted, a vessel of chaos, and to help him would be to invite his curse upon oneself. They had not just sentenced him to death. They had made his very presence a contagion. The officials, the guards, and the last of the trailing crowd departed, their forms slowly dissolving into the heat haze. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind across the pottery hills and the endless hum of the flies. Kenamon was alone, truly alone, in a way he had never imagined possible. He was a man without a name, without a future, without a past, without a god, and without a people. He was just a piece of branded, bleeding meat left to rot on a garbage heap. He tried to push himself up, but the pain was a white-hot ocean, and he collapsed back onto the sharp-edged shards. He lifted his head one last time and looked west toward the Valley of the Nobles, where his tomb was being desecrated, its beautiful paintings being hacked to pieces. He thought of his soul, his bar, awakening in that darkness, blind and lost. And for the first time, Kenamon, the high priest of Amun-Ra, began to scream. But there was no one left to hear. His humiliation was complete. He had been a pillar of the cosmos, and now he was nothing, an offering to the endless hungry desert. While Kenamon's screams were swallowed by the vast indifference of the desert, a different kind of humiliation was unfolding within the stone walls of a military garrison on the Nubian frontier. This punishment was not for a crime against the gods, but for a failure that was, in its own way, just as profound a betrayal of Ma'at, cowardice in the face of the enemy. The Egyptian state was a machine of order, and its army was the sharpened edge that kept the forces of chaos, the Libyans, the Nubians, the Hittites, at bay. A soldier's duty was not just to the pharaoh, but to the cosmic balance. To flee in battle was to allow a crack to form in the divine wall that protected Egypt from the outside world. It was an act of treason against existence itself. The man at the centre of this ritual was a standard-bearer named Bak. He was not a general, but his role was sacred. The standard he carried topped with the golden image of a ram, was not a mere flag. It was the physical incarnation of the regiment's spirit, a mobile idol that channeled the power of the gods onto the battlefield. To lose it was unthinkable. Yet in a skirmish with a band of Nubian raiders, Bak had dropped the standard and run. His entire regiment, some 200 men, were now assembled in the garrison's main courtyard. Their faces grim, their silence a heavy, suffocating blanket under the Nubian sun. They were not here to witness an execution. Bak would not be killed. Instead, he would be made to live. But his life would be a lesson. This was the ceremony of the Eater of Shame. Its purpose was not to punish one man, but to cauterize a wound in the honour of the entire regiment. General Horemheb, a man carved from the same granite as the royal colossi, stood on a raised platform, his gaze sweeping over his men. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "The spirit of this regiment has been defiled," he began, his eyes locking onto Bak, who stood alone and trembling in the centre of the courtyard. "It has been dropped in the dirt and shame before our enemies. A spirit that is shamed cannot fight. A spirit that is shamed invites defeat. Today we will cleanse that spirit." 2 soldiers dragged Bak forward and forced him to his knees. He was not stripped or bound. Instead, a 3rd soldier approached carrying a simple clay bowl. Inside was a thick grey paste. It was a mixture of ashes from the garrison's hearth, sand from the spot where the standard had fallen, and most symbolically, the urine of his fellow soldiers. It was a concoction of everything that was base, discarded, and unclean. "The standard is the soul of our brotherhood," the general continued, his voice like the scraping of stone on stone. "You, Bak, have made our soul eat dust. Now you will take that shame into your own body. You will consume our disgrace, so that we may be made clean again." The soldier with the bowl tilted it towards Bak's mouth. Bak clenched his jaw shut, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and revulsion. This was a violation more intimate than a flogging, an invasion of the self that went beyond skin and bone. The soldier, without a word, drove a fist into Bak's stomach. The air rushed out of his lungs in a pained gasp, and in that moment the other soldier forced the rim of the bowl between his teeth and poured. The thick, gritty paste filled his mouth, its taste a vile combination of salt, ash, and bitterness. He gagged, his body convulsing, but the guards held his head fast, forcing him to swallow. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the grey sludge that dribbled from his lips. The entire regiment watched in dead silence. This was not about disgust. It was a deeply symbolic act. By physically consuming the elements of his own failure, Bak was becoming a living vessel for the regiment's shame. He was ingesting their collective dishonour, taking it from the realm of the abstract and making it a part of his own flesh. It was a form of ritual purification by scapegoat, where the scapegoat was not driven out, but made to internalise the very sin he had caused. When the bowl was empty, he was released, and he collapsed, retching and sobbing onto the parade ground. But his ordeal was not over. The physical act was just the prelude to the social one. General Horemheb made a gesture, and the regiment's new standard-bearer, a young proud warrior, stepped forward, lifting the newly consecrated standard high. The men let out a single, unified shout, a roar of renewed loyalty and purpose. And as they did, they turned their backs on Bak. This was the final and most devastating part of the punishment. From that moment on, Bak was to be treated as if he did not exist. He was a ghost in his own barracks. He would still receive his rations, but they would be left on the ground outside his tent. He would still march with the regiment, but he would march at the very rear, alone. No one would speak to him. No one would meet his gaze. If he spoke, he would receive no answer. He had been ostracised, rendered invisible and inaudible by the collective will of the men he had once called brothers. For a soldier in the tight-knit, isolated world of a frontier garrison, this was a living death. The silence was a constant, deafening roar of condemnation. Every meal, eaten alone, every night spent in solitude, every averted gaze was a fresh blow, a reminder of his shame. This punishment could last for months, sometimes years, until the general deemed the shame to be fully digested and the regiment's honour restored. Some men went mad under the strain. their minds cracking under the pressure of total social isolation. They would be found wandering in the desert, talking to themselves, their spirits broken as surely as if they had been shattered on a wheel. It was a psychological torment, so complete that many soldiers who endured it said they would have preferred a quick, clean death. It was the Egyptian understanding of hell, brought to life not with fire and brimstone, but with the terrifying, soul-crushing power of silence. The silence of the barracks and the desolation of the desert were punishments designed to unravel the soul over time. But there was another form of public humiliation in Egypt, one reserved not for criminals or cowards, but for the most powerful figures of all, when they failed in their sacred duty: the dead. In the Egyptian worldview, death was not an end but a transition, a dangerous journey to the field of reeds, the eternal paradise. This journey was entirely dependent on two things: the preservation of the body through mummification and the preservation of the name through inscriptions and monuments. To deny a person these things was to condemn them to the ultimate horror, a second and final death. It was to be devoured by the demon Amit, to cease to exist entirely. This fear of oblivion was the most powerful tool of control the state possessed, and they used it to reach beyond the grave, inflicting a humiliation that would echo for eternity. The most spectacular example of this was inflicted upon a pharaoh, a woman who had dared to rule as a king, Hatshepsut. For 22 years, Hatshepsut had been one of the most successful pharaohs in Egypt's history. She had commanded armies, overseen a golden age of prosperity, and built monuments so magnificent they dwarfed those of her predecessors. She had ruled not as a queen regent, but as a full-fledged king, adopting the male titles, the false beard, and the divine authority of the office. She had maintained Ma'at and enriched Egypt, but in doing so, she had committed an unforgivable transgression. She had upset the cosmic order. The role of pharaoh was fundamentally male, a manifestation of the god Horus. A woman in that role, no matter how successful, was a dissonant note in the symphony of the universe. While she lived, her power was absolute, and no one dared to challenge her. But death was the great equalizer. Some 20 years after she was laid to rest in her magnificent tomb in the Valley of the Kings, her successor, Thutmose III, began one of the most thorough and systematic campaigns of personal destruction in human history. This was not a fit of pique or a moment of rage. It was a cold, calculated, and brutally efficient act of state-sponsored damnation carried out over decades. Armies of stonemasons were dispatched to every corner of the Egyptian empire, from the northern delta to the southern reaches of Nubia. Their orders were simple: find every image of Hatshepsut, find every instance of her name, and erase them from existence. On the towering obelisks at Karnak, they painstakingly chiselled out her figure, leaving a ghostly, king-shaped void in the sacred reliefs. In her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, they hammered away her face, smashed her statues into thousands of pieces, and walled up her shrines. They worked with a terrifying precision, attacking her cartouches, the oval rings that encircled a royal name, and scraping away the hieroglyphs of her identity. They were not just destroying history, they were trying to retroactively edit reality. Their goal was to make it so that, to the gods and to future generations, it would appear as if she had never existed at all. Imagine the psychological impact of this. For a generation, Egyptians had seen Hatshepsut's face on every temple wall, her name invoked in every prayer. Now they were forced to witness her systematic unmaking. They watched as the familiar images were chipped away, as the sacred names were turned to dust. It was a public lesson on the grandest scale imaginable. The message was clear. No one, not even a pharaoh who had brought peace and prosperity, was above the divine order. Her success in life was irrelevant compared to her fundamental transgression of Ma'at. Every falling chip of stone was a reminder that the state's memory was long, and its power extended far beyond the grave. The workers who smashed her statues would tell their children the story of the female king who was devoured by silence. The priests who oversaw the erasures would amend the king lists, simply skipping her name as if her reign had been an empty space in time. She was being made into a ghost. Her entire 22-year reign transformed into a state-enforced secret, a historical black hole. This posthumous humiliation was the ultimate expression of Egyptian power. It demonstrated that the state could not only control your life, your body, and your social standing, but also your very soul and its chance at eternal life. Khnaaman, the priest, was branded and cast into the desert, his name scraped from a few stones, his suffering over in a matter of days. Merit, the adulteress, was mutilated, forced to wear her shame on her face for a lifetime. Bak, the soldier, was drowned in a sea of silence, his spirit slowly eroded by isolation. But Hatshepsut faced a damnation far more profound. They sought to unwrite her from the book of existence itself, to ensure her soul would awaken in the afterlife with no name to speak, no face to be recognized by the gods, and no path to follow. She would be lost, an eternal wanderer in the void. The most powerful person of her time, reduced to a cosmic footnote. This was the final, terrifying truth of justice in ancient Egypt. The body was a temporary vessel, but the name was eternal. And there was no humiliation more horrific, no punishment that went further than the quiet, patient, and methodical act of making someone, and everyone they had ever been, simply disappear.